Oh, hi, Mark. I'm really glad you're available to work on this. It's a doozy. There's a startup called Screenless that's working on some crazy technology to basically embed a touchscreen in your skin. Yeah, that's not creepy at all. We shot some proof of concept spots for it that they want to use to fundraise for it, and we need you to track the fake UI stuff onto the talent's skin. The edits are done, and we have all of the designs to work with so you can focus on the compositing. We've also included some reference from the set to help you with sizing and placement of the designs. If you have the bandwidth, you can even play with animation a bit. We're going to have you work on the business spot since you're a guy who means business. This is a challenging one, but I know you're up to the task.
In business, speed is everything. And Screenless's device-free technology helps you operate fast and efficiently. It keeps you up to date with the market and with your team.
Presentation's great. Let's send it.
The future is Screenless.
Wow. So these business people are so focused on time, they're willing to get an iWatch embedded into their skin. Awesome. For this week's lesson, I am going to take a different approach again, but I'm going to take a different approach this time. Just like last week, I'm going to actually start by showing you what I got to. Here we go. So all I did with the Premiere edit that came in with multiple layers is organize it into shots, which you've seen me done before. And here you see the shot by shot as a layer stack in one big comp that I can render out at the end. And the green ones are the ones that actually had work on them. And other than the first and last one, which I think you already know how to do, but I'll take a quick look at them. The others were kind of theme and variation. And each one of them is effectively 3 layers deep. And I'll explain that. And I started with the easiest ones, the ones I thought were easiest, which are the ones where the wrist is not being turned in a 180. Then I tackled one of the ones where it is, and finally this shot. And I'm going to focus a lot on this shot because this had the most learning opportunities in it. But I'm going to highlight for you at each level what really kind of stood out here to build upon what we had in our last lesson. So just as was the case a couple of weeks ago with keying, in this more advanced second lesson, we're not so much going to be taking a whole new approach that you've never tried, but rather refining what you've already learned and helping you deal confidently with situations that without the skill set might seem too difficult, including how to get through things where the tools don't quite get the job done and you have to figure out a way to help them. But to start with, we're going to look at some of the easy stuff. So to begin with, to remove this sign on the building, which the client didn't even ask me to do, but come on, it's distracting and somebody could come after them, right? So this one didn't even require any tracking. All I did was mask out some bricks and let the built-in camera motion do the same. And the only reason I was able to do it that way is this is the world's most generic brick wall right here. And then of course, changing the sign, you've seen me do this. To honor School of Motion, I used my favorite font, DIN. Maybe it's my favorite. It's one of my favorites. Okay, then at the end, this cafe shot, of course, I didn't even track at all. I actually just hand masked and animated for a few frames and relied on motion blur, in fact. So I don't think I even put any feather on these. Let me double check that that's true. Yep, no feather on that mug. So all that is just motion blur. Now again, I don't think the client specified that they wanted the logo in front of the coffee cup, but guess what? I just think it's a better shot if we position it kind of centered like that. It just felt like the right place for it. 5 minutes of roto and we're good to go. Okay, well, that's about it. That's pretty much what we had in the lesson, so I hope you learned a lot. All right, I can tell by the look on your face you want more, so here's more. I'm in preferences right now to just call out this synchronized time of all related items checkbox. And if you're going to be pre-comping like this, what you're going to find is I could be in this comp, then I go back to this one, and I've got no playhead, no time controller. But in my master comp, it knows that I was in that shot. I prefer it that way, but if you start to get tired of this, you can disable that synchronization and then keep your playhead wherever you want it in each of your comps. I don't particularly mind the extra click, and I do sometimes mind chasing down, syncing things up when I'm working 3 comps deep, which is exactly what I'm about to show you. Another thing I really appreciate is a well-named and well-organized project, and that's what we have here. Actually, while I was talking just now, I also went ahead and named the 2 layers here that still had their source names and gave them names that are very intuitive when you just glance at this. So I'll talk you through that, maybe now or maybe in a little bit. But I do want to show you what's in the plate layer and why that one's pre-comped. The plate in each case, the source background footage, is scaled. Sometimes it's 70, sometimes it's 50%. It was all shot mostly, I think, at 4K. This one was reframed not to 50%, but actually a little bit more zoomed in so that we can really clearly see the UI on his wrist. And if we go back to the main comp for the shot, there is my finger, and then there are 3 layers that are all basically identical. So if I turn on the bottom one and the plate, that is most of the work. In other words, this is the shot that is tracked in and warped, distorted to make it look like it's conforming to the wrist. And then these other layers are providing a little bit of extra comping. So there's a screen layer, and I fiddled with these enough that I have to look to see what I did. So I was playing around with the tint, but I ended up with just a bit of blur on here, and that just gives it a gentle kind of glow. And then there is the top layer in add mode to really pop the brightness and make this look a little bit self-illuminated. On the whole, I really wanted a look to these that is somewhat like a tattoo. And so my base layer has that. The skin is even showing through the areas that would be white. But then there was a request to just make it pop, and it didn't really work to give it sort of a monitor sheen. It needs to look, to me at least, it needs to look like it's on skin. But we also want it to look like something that would illuminate in the dark, because as I'm sure you know, that is something you would want embedded below your skin. Yes, I can feel you rolling your eyes from here. So here are the 4 comps that had all of the tracking in them, and they've each got a similar setup, which I want to show you. The green layers are the background, the plate, and if there's an element from the plate that's used, like this finger that comes in here and touches the UI, that one's also green, because the next layer down is just that plate layer. There are a couple of adjustments on it. It has a color correction from the client, and I like putting that in a pre-comp so I don't touch it and it doesn't get into my workflow. I just don't think about it. And I also have the scales embedded in here, and that was important to do because when you're running shots through Mocha in particular, or any tracker really, or just in general, you ideally want them to be at comp size. In fact, you really should have them that way, or things can get into that train wreck territory that you want to avoid. So that's what I did with each of these. So you'll see basically a similar setup in each. Now, the orange layers are my overlay UI elements, at least at this first. This is my first level of each of these, right? The basic shot assembly. And this is some of the work that I did at the end to just finish the look. So I'm going to solo layers for a second. The basic look, and most of the time I was working, I was going with this. So this is a darker color transfer mode. And that is kind of like the base layer. And I like it because it looks like kind of like a tattoo. And there's a little bit of color matching being done there. And there's a little bit of blurring to match the focus of the shot. And then the corner pin is the track, and we're going to get to that separately. That same corner pin is shared by the other two layers. In fact, it's just copied and pasted. And I'm fine with doing that because I'm not adjusting it. It would be a train wreck if I adjusted one of them and the other two are supposed to directly screen and add on top of it, but that's not an issue here. I have a couple extra effects sitting in these where I was trying a few things, but fundamentally the screen layer just has a little blur on it, and that is meant to just make things pop and glow gently. And then this top layer that I'm calling sheen is really meant to get the colors vibrant. I think the idea here, even though it scares me, is that this thing is supposed to be luminescent. So in other words, you could look at your screenless device even in the dark, which, wow, I don't even want to think about that. But that is also kind of what you would expect from, say, an iWatch or other electronic device, that it be kind of bright and saturated. And so that's how we achieved that. I did play around with some other stuff. I looked at putting some gradients in these, giving them a little screen sheen, which is why this layer was originally called sheen, and it just wasn't really working. So I'm not really sharing that. I mention it because you may have your own take that you want to put on these, and that is totally cool. Now, this same pattern was continued through all 4 of the track shots. So this one, same basic setup, plate, 3 layers. I didn't name them the same way here, but it's the same opacity and transfer modes going on here. This has a series of nulls because this was the hard one. Again, there's a finger overlay that comes in here. Same pattern here, again with a bit of foreground. And most of this foreground I did not track because it's so short and it was just so simple to keyframe a mask. So it ended up just being a few keyframes like that. The reason I have keyframes beyond the layered duration here is for motion blur. So there is, in most cases, no feather on these masks, and I am only relying on motion blur being enabled to get them looking right. And then here's the same pattern again. This one has no finger getting in there, and there you have it. That is the comping portion of these shots. So now I'm going to talk about the methods that were used to distort the flat layers so that they appear curved and conform to the wrist. This is maybe some of you already know how to do. You may even know how to do it already in After Effects, but most people don't. And in fact, it would be easy to assume that you can't, because After Effects isn't really truly 3D in many ways, and yet the tools to do this actually have been in the application for a very long time. Now I'm going to talk about the methods that were used to distort the UI to conform with the wrist. It wasn't the same approach every time, but it was fundamentally one of 2 approaches. On this first shot, we go 1 layer deeper into that orange layer that has the UI in it. You can see I have a guide layer behind here, and that was really just there to get the thing basically angled and positioned, but this is tracked in the main comp. We'll get back there. So the purpose of this comp is purely to warp the UI to give it the look that we want. Now in this case, this has a mesh warp effect applied to it. And I'm going to show you how I did that from scratch, but let me actually give you an overview first. So there is the mesh warp effect in the case of this second example, which, just to remind you, is this kind of complicated one here. Because the UI has to go all the way around the wrist and turn around it and then get flicked around it again. The solution here is one you may not be familiar with, and it goes way back in After Effects history, but it is the cylinder effect, and it's one of the few actual 3D simulation plugins you'll find in After Effects, and it's one of the few ways to actually curve a shot, or rather a layer, in a three-dimensional way. So it's pretty lucky that we have this in this case, as crude as it is. Now, I will also get into the setup for this one because it was a little tricky. In fact, it was more than a little tricky, and it's something that I believe you're going to have to do in your own shots as well. In this third shot, the approach is again mesh warp, and the main reason for that is that the only animation happening here is changes to the UI, but we're staying in this one view. We're not flipping the wrist or flicking things circularly around it. And so if you want to see the mesh warp effect here, it previews like that. Looks very similar to the other one that we already saw. And then in this final example, which, because there's no reference plate in that one, to remind you, is just this one. In this case, the reference was so simple, it's almost just completely straight up and down. I didn't place one in here. And here we are back to the cylinder effect. So cylinder and warp were the two methods that I pretty much relied on, and I chose one or the other based on whether the UI actually had to animate in a 360 fashion like that. Now, CC cylinder is kind of cool because it's so primitive, and yet you can do stuff with it that you might otherwise think you couldn't. And in fact, without this one effect, you really couldn't. But mesh warp is actually responsible for some of the more sophisticated compositing effects I've done. In fact, I'm thinking specifically right now of this whole sequence in Day After Tomorrow where we took these matte paintings of the supercell, which was this weather formation that was going to destroy humanity. And rather than doing it as a 3D simulation, it was actually all done by warping paintings of clouds. It's really great, this effect, for running liquid through it and bending that. And in this case, it's also going to be helpful for just getting a flat layer to conform to an organic surface. All right, I was given serious props a second ago to the CC cylinder effect because of what you can get away with. But mesh warp, to be honest, is a more all-around useful tool where I've seen it save situations that would have otherwise required a 3D simulation. No joke. So here's basically how it works. And to show you this, I am going to start from scratch. I was zoomed out because I wanted you to see the layer, which started out looking like this. So this is just my UI elements in the foreground here. And I'll reset this, and that's what you get by default. So a 7x7 grid, which is almost never what you want. It sounds really good, but the way you adjust the grid is just one point at a time. And so as you can imagine, for the simple thing I'm trying to do here, that would be a lot of adjustments. So instead, the first thing I did was to reduce this down to 2 and 2. So that is how it looked. Now it's not moving around, right? That was the point. So the video is just a reference. And at the time I was doing this, I didn't have all the UI animation happening. That's all stuff I think you guys know how to do, but we'll take a brief look at that as well. That's all happening in the pre-comp here. So all we're doing here is warping this thing into place. And so the simple way to do it is just to grab a point, or maybe a couple of them, and drag them up like that. And then maybe grab a couple over here. And I went ahead and made these tangential to the line. I can't do that with multi-select, so I can move them that way. And it's really easy to inadvertently do what I just did and lose the effect. I don't think you can choose it here, so we have to go back to where I can select it again. But that's what I end up doing. And yes, I am doing this visually. So really, I'm just creating what I consider to be kind of a pretty arc here. And then what the reference is allowing me to do is gauge what the kind of width and contour of this should be. I don't really want to change the look of the UI significantly, like make it look too narrow or what have you. But I do want to just taper this in a bit so that it conforms to the shape of the wrist and the arm. And so I end up with something kind of like that. Now, zoomed in here, you can see a bit of quantizing on this line. And you might as well just increase quality from the default of 8 to 10 in almost any case, unless you really want a more jaggy, quantized look. For a smooth curve, just take it up to 10. There's no 11, but you can go to 10. So the UI work I did on this was not really my focus, but I'm going to show you what's in there just in case you have any questions about it. It'll be a pretty quick rundown. The next layer down for each of these is just pure UI animation of elements from Illustrator. So here toward the end of the first one, we fade out the buttons and scale, blur, and shrinky-dink down the screen, kind of like an old television. And then in this one, for the actual UI of audio, I thought about doing some audio sampling and turning that into some expressions and rigging the whole thing up. And then I realized all I really had to do was get an image of any old waveform. So I got that one and I ran it, animated it basically across, you know, like right to left. And then I gave it kind of a different look by masking it out with this set of hashes here, which initially I was thinking about animating, and then I decided to do this instead to give it just a little bit different look. And then of course I've got just some shape animations, and those are hand keyframed. Let's use the Uber key. So here's my little keyframes, and they're not really attempting to match the actual audio at all. And then of course these keyframes here are just for the text that animates on. To show you the CC cylinder effect and how I made the best possible use of it for this sequence, I'm going to actually break down my own effects and kind of redo them from scratch so that you can kind of get the idea for your own how to build them up and not kind of get stuck in the crudeness of our good friend CC cylinder. To show you this CC cylinder effect and how I set it up to actually work in here, given its age and lack of flexibility, I am going to start from scratch and give you a little bit of my thinking process on it. So here's the element, which I'm just going to make a new temporary comp, just for the purpose of showing you this. SOM Inc. Wow, I didn't know they were public. For this, we go into the rare perspective category. And CC is one of the Psycore effects that, wow, Adobe purchased so long ago. Many of us, many of you weren't even alive yet. So that's the effect applied. So maybe this is what you want, a label wrapping around a bottle. But if you want anything else, you don't have so many options just right in the effect. Specifically, yes, I can adjust the radius, but that doesn't change the wrap amount, right? Changing the position doesn't do anything for me. I can certainly rotate the thing and also rotate it into place. So rotating it in Y ends up being the key to animating this and the whole reason really that I want it. And then there's light and shading, which For my purposes, I pretty much just killed. So you could mess around with changing the light direction and the ambient and so on, but this is just not what I was going for at all. So if you kill it, your element's a little darker, but you don't have to deal with the fact that there's shading on it. And of course you can take your own approach. I guess you could try all ambient lighting. Yeah, that would work. In any case, I didn't mess around with specularity and so on. So in fact, for this first one, because it is lit from the right, I did actually use mostly the default lighting and just lit it from the right. It didn't seem like such a strong choice that I had to get rid of it. So all I'm doing is rotating this in the level of comp that we were just looking at. But how did I get it not to wrap around in a perfect 360 and to transition? Well, obviously, that I had to do in the pre-comp. If I take the effect off, you can kind of see what's happening in the pre-comp. In fact, you can fully see what's happening in the pre-comp, and that includes the directional blur that is covering when it is being spun. And here it gets spun again, over to that one. So in fact, you can see the width of the comp, and if I now go into there and show it to you, there aren't a whole lot of surprises. This is the width of the comp. I just basically worked out that this would get the UI about the right number of degrees around the 360 and give me the max resolution. So this is where I landed and where I did my animation. And initially I was worried about, oh, where's the screen cutoff? And then I realized, oh yeah, for this device, maybe there is no screen cutoff. It's just taking up more of your arm. So that's where I went with it. You, again, in your own version, may have your own creative decisions on that one. And then for this guy, it was really a question of matching the timing. One thing I will point out before I go into the subcomp, there were cases where it would have been appropriate to potentially throw a mesh warp on top of the cylinder to get it to taper a little more. I was right on the edge of doing it in a couple cases, and this is one of them. In fact, that, yeah, it would look a little better, but it happens really quickly, and at some level you're always getting away with stuff, so that's where I left it. So this guy, really, it's just a question of getting, again, the right amount on the 360, and it's just front and center. And then there's some motion blur, and that is 100% all. And when you see a channel blur in here, that is just a gentle bit of blurring on the very border, so not to the content, but just to match the softness of the edges in the scene. And so channel blur lets you go into just the alpha and blur only that. What's that you say? Tracking? Oh, you want to learn about tracking too? Oh, all right. Yeah, let's talk about that. Now I can hear you screaming, Mark, Mark, Mark. It's a tracking lesson. When are we doing the damn tracking? Let's do that now. This is the first shot that I tracked, and there was one thing about this that I can remember being a little tricky. This ended up being my tracking target, and this actually worked well. What I learned was my choice of target made a huge difference, even though many different things tracked accurately. I want you to notice that there are no tracking markers on these hands. Now, if you find yourself on a production like this, you could add, say, a dot if that would help your talent hit the same spot. This talent was actually really good. In fact, I noticed when I had to line up the UIs later in the sequence that the finger was hitting the exact right spot. And there are other productions where, for God's sake, they'd put stickers on the hand, they'd make a transparent version of the UI, which would change later, and it'd be a big mess. And I like the opposite. And I want you to learn that you don't need lots of tracking markers. Now, when we planned this, I didn't realize we were going to shoot it quite so blown out. And if it was more blown out than this, and I really had very little detail, I could even try to recover some of the detail to get some of the natural tracking markers that are in here. What I found, though, basically was if I chose a spot up toward the top of the hand, even though he's keeping his hand very rigid, just little things like that amount of movement in the skin, plus having to account for the finger, which led me to want to track more on this side, wasn't working, because when I got down to the sleeve here, that's an absolute boundary that it's easy to spot. And if my UI is not lining up with that, it just doesn't look right unless, you know, it looks like the sleeve is moving, which really does not look like that. So that is how I ended up tracking in this position. We then took that and aligned the surface with the full frame, as you saw me do in the previous lesson. So there is the full frame alignment, and that allowed me to not have to pre-comp and then scale my UI just to fit in there. Instead, I was able to make it the size I wanted for the overall layer, and then corner pin the overall layer. In many cases, it's a good idea to choose a tracking area that overlaps with or even is centered in where you're going to be placing your element. Now here, I want to avoid the finger because I don't want to have to deal with it, nor anything to do with his face. But I also found if I went too far to the left, I had to deal with how the arm is turning, which you can barely tell, but look here at the end, it does turn and foreshorten that shaded area. So I didn't really want to get in there at all. Notice also these little freckles, which effectively are like tracking markers. They're not really anything Mocha needs because it can get into all of this detail here, but it helps me see what's going on with the track and how well it's sticking, and also where to position my UI. This final shot presented a bit of a dilemma. The problem is that Mocha naturally wants to try to follow the way the arm is turning. In fact, you'd think you'd be stuck with that so that it would look for, say, the surface of the forearm, and that would then skew. And so what I actually realized I had to do was only track for transformation, not even scale and rotation. And that forced the tracker to only look for that, and it actually did a surprisingly good job at that. And then if we look in the comp itself, you can see that indeed all I applied was position. There's no corner pin, unlike the last two we just looked at. And then the anchor point is to fix where that track kind of went over to the right at the end. So it was just to specify how the UI would sit in place there. And then these rotation keyframes are just completely by hand. And that is really just to, as I said, avoid having to do any more than just rotate it into place to get it to stick. Oh yeah, so it doesn't really get any gnarlier than that, does it? And that leaves this bad boy here. Now, I've exposed just the keyframes that were applied to nulls. I applied them to nulls in order to allow me to chain together multiple tracks. There was no other way to do it. If we look in Mocha, you can see my 3 layers with tracking data on them. Well, actually 2 of them have tracking data, and then this one just has some basic start and end frames, and everything else that was done on that was done with in-between frames right on the layer itself. I will explain. But for now, I just want to show you that in Mocha, I do have 3 layers that correspond to the 3 you see in the timeline. And one of them is indeed turned off because it was a fail. I was going to close that, but actually, let's just take a look at these right in here. So one at a time. And I did these in order. And with this first track, I stopped it there, and I will show you why. So there is where I set my initial keyframe. Let me re-enable it and show you what happens. And right now I only have skew, so actually I'm going to enable perspective. I tried it both ways. And that's where, with or without perspective, it just could not hold onto all of that blur, the turning of the wrist, and so on. So that is why I stopped that track where I did. So I'm going to apply this just to show you what you get when you only use a section of a track like that. Before I do that, let's take a look in classic view. Go to the dope sheet. And in fact, part 1 does have keyframes toward the end. So that's what you see in the UI, and this is what I was trying to remind myself about actually. So I'm not really sure. I think I must have just let it run, and I didn't delete them all. I'm going to delete them just to prove a point here. And if you're thinking, oh no, is he going to tell us that we need to know something about keyframes in Mocha? Well, no. But on the other hand, why be afraid of them? They're right here. There's almost nothing to them. And all I did was get rid of the animation that was being held in that layer when I'd done my test, which I wasn't using anyway. And here's why. So the really important thing to know here is that this track broke. Like, if you didn't know what you were doing or how to problem solve, you at some level would give up because the automated tool didn't get the job done. And we're After Effects artists, so we know how this goes. Let's take a closer look at how to work through a situation like this with chain nulls. Now I'm going to apply that keyframe data, but this is going to break my comp. So I'm going to be careful to at least make this useful. And the way I'm going to do that is to take off parenting at the first frame of the whole thing. All right, so now we're only dealing with this first null. And the reason for this is I'm showing you why I didn't do this all with one track, right? And I'm also showing you what happens when you get bad track data that you don't want. So here is Mocha. I create track data for wrist part 1. I'm just double checking. Okay, that's good. I'm going to apply it to that layer 4, which it's applied to as a transform, not as a corner pin. And there are all the keyframes, even though I deleted out all the ones after this point. So if I highlight that null, you can see that it stops moving after that frame. Okay, so all I really wanted to show you is that the watch is for no apparent reason starting to scale down and rotate here. And part of the problem is that the tracking mark is way over here, but something else is just kind of going on. So my fix for this was to delete a bunch of the scale and rotation values that were offending. So now I'm going to undo back to where I did that rather than redo it because it's just going to get so gnarly. It's easy to see where I did that, and if I undo back far enough, the parenting will be back in place like so. So by removing scale and rotation after this point, that stayed good. And then at this point, I start to animate the element itself by hand, okay? Because there was, as you saw, no way across this bridge here, right? So rather than try to keep forcing some automated method to do it, I just went in and did it by hand. And I did it the same way you've seen me do all my animation, block in the farthest keyframe in between, add other ones as needed to tweak. As with the other examples, you can see here where a bit of taper from mesh warp could have made this look even better. If I thought anyone was ever going to freeze on this frame, I would definitely fix that, but I think it goes by so fast and creates a smooth motion that I did not want to go there. Okay? that left the end of the shot. Let's take a look at that. So now the only keyframes I have are from this point onward, as you can see. Let me go back to Essentials View. I've come to really like Essentials View. The key here, well, there were a couple keys here. 1, stay away from the finger. 2, stay away from letting the skin ripple mess up the animation. But that initially had me tracking way up here, and then I realized that's a problem because that's not where my element is going, and I needed to be closer to where the element is going, specifically to avoid that other problem that I just had, where if the pivot point is off or whatever, things can go kind of off the rails. So the other thing I did, and this is a trick I haven't shown you yet, in Classic View, you can change the minimum pixels used amount. Now, there are a bunch of hash marks here, so obviously I slightly broke Mocha, but you can set this to 100. And remember, it's got this weird UI, so if you want to do it by scrubbing, you do it like that. When you set it to 100, you can often get rid of some of the error that you'd otherwise get from things like that little finger ripple. Your mileage may vary, but this is a common trick to use in order to get rid of variables in a track. Okay, so I'm not going to save this because I've now messed with it. I'm just going to close it up. All right, well, much as I would like my course to just be teaching you how to make tracking effortless and work on the first try every time, there are times when it doesn't work at all, not just in After Effects. And it's really helpful to know how to get results anyway. Let's take a closer look. All right, I want to make super sure you understand about the chain parenting of this. I think you get it, but I want to carefully talk you through it because it's a really important concept to understand with tracking in general. So what I've done is exposed all of the keyframes in my timeline. Now, I'm going to close the plate layer because that's just Mocha keyframes, and those are just the placeholders of my keyframe data. I'm also going to close the finger because that is just a hand masked element, the same way I did the other ones that I showed you already. And that leaves me with the keyframes that I added to hand animate this middle section that I couldn't track, and then these 3 nulls. And what I want to do is just build the whole thing up really quickly, one by one, just to make sure it's crystal clear, okay, how chain parenting works. So to do this, I'm going to take parenting off of this bottom layer. The other 2 layers are just parented to this one, okay, so those don't count. But by taking that off, now all I've got is that interim animation that's now broken. It's fine, okay? And then I'm also going to set these other 2 to none as well. So now, if I reparent to the first null, as you saw, I'm going to get my first bit of animation and then the broken bit. Now, I didn't do these hand keyframes until after I did the bridge keyframes here. So really, technically, I should have taken those out as well, but I think you get the idea. So now I'm going to parent this second null to the first one, and instead of parenting the graphics to the first null, I'm going to parent those to the second one. And now it's getting all the keyframes from the first one followed by the keyframes of the second one. Let's see if it works. Oh wow, okay, so I managed not to break that. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can actually see it. So basically what I had to do there was create a bridge between one viable track that needed a little help and another one that, on admittedly my second try, is pretty flawless. So that's not bad, because really there's about a dozen, maybe 15 frames that I had to carefully do by hand, but the rest of it is actually working out, and so now we're going to finish the shot. So then, having done all that and having tracked the last portion accurately, I just had to do the same thing again. So I'm always going to go back to frame 0 to do this. Set this to none. Parent this set of keyframes to null number 2 at this exact transition point. Go back to frame 0 and reestablish parenting this time to null 3. Ooh, my pick whip is sticking a little bit. There we go. And that was it. Now, there were a few other finesse keyframes initially that I tried and then got rid of, and essentially I managed to make it work. So the finesse keyframes were because I didn't have a good track until I redid this one the way you see it here. And with a solid track like that, I didn't have to do any extra work. Now, I want to emphasize again, what you're seeing was not exactly my first try. That last section didn't actually track so cleanly. There are other shots in this where if I had the tracker kind of focused on the wrong thing, like let's say it was focused on the top of the wrist, then things at the bottom weren't lining up. As I mentioned, I could have gone further. I could have used mesh warp to conform my shapes more closely to the wrist. But I think that, first of all, you've got some good skills here. And second of all, I want you to know that this went pretty well. And having to blow up a key or a section of one and redo it again, it's all part of the game. And it works out pretty well. The fact that I had to show you to do it probably made mine even a bit better. But you're kind of also seeing this like warts and all, which is cool. And that is just about it. Here you see the result of a LUT that the client had provided, applied with Lumetri Color. And I went ahead and made the adjustments that you saw to my individual layers, that mix of 3 layers with add, screen, and darken color. I dialed that in looking at this. So I wanted a little bit of this kind of luminescent quality happening, but not enough to completely change the color of it. And of course, everything can be dialed in further. The thing I wanted to show you is a phenomenon known as the kiss of love. So looking at this frame, I'm just curious if you can see my kiss of love. So the kiss of love is a detail that you add simply because you wanted to make the shot even better than what was already going to be good enough to get it approved. And my kiss of love here is this little hair. I know, ridiculous, right? Well, here's the deal. There's the mask that I made for this one hair. If I turn it off, and I'll just disable it on this one layer, the shot still looks fine. And you're like, come on, Mark, you gotta be kidding me. But what I noticed when I was working on it was bothering me that there's all this arm hair and none of it overlaps. And I tried creating a luminance matte because he's blonde. I thought, oh, maybe I can just luma out just the blonde hairs, and that totally didn't work because of the diverse lighting on his skin. And I thought, oh man, how the hell, I don't think I can do it. And then I realized, like, wait a minute, what caught my attention was this one hair that's so clearly cut off that this thing looks overlaid on it. And just by taking care of that one, you're not really supposed to notice it, but all of a sudden, oh, maybe you believe just a little bit more. This may not be the last time you hear me mention the kiss of love. Credit for that goes to my pal Stu Mashwitz, without whom I probably wouldn't be here teaching you this right now. And it was actually a term that he introduced to his team in the Rebel Mac unit at ILM during work on the Phantom Menace. I was actually also working on stuff for Phantom Menace over at LucasArts at that time. Anyway, I think it's a really cool concept, and as you saw, it doesn't necessarily take a lot of extra time. It just takes stepping back for a moment and noticing, like, wow, what would make this even better? And honestly, a teeny little hair can give you a lot of joy. Okay, bye. No, seriously though.